Oasis Audio presents The Three Heavens by John Hagee, read for you by Dean Gallagher. Section 1. The First Heaven. Chapter 1. Mommy, God is alive. It began as a normal day. I was at the office by 7 a.m. working on my next sermon series when I received an unexpected call from Diana. She explained that our 5-month-old grandson, Wyatt, had been admitted to the hospital with RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, a serious lung infection, and asked me to pray. We prayed for Wyatt's healing, and I made plans to meet her at the hospital. However, before I could leave my office, Diana called again, informing me that Ellie, our 18-month-old granddaughter, was also being admitted to the same hospital with the same virus. My day was no longer normal. The Hagee family prayer chain was in full force, and we began to circle the wagons. When I arrived at the hospital, I learned that our 2 grandchildren were in adjoining rooms, which made it easier for Nana and Papa to divide our time between them. After a full day of assisting our daughters with our ailing grandchildren, Diana and I went home so I could prepare to leave town for a speaking engagement. I quickly packed. We drove to the airport, and Diana returned to the hospital. As my wife walked back into Wyatt's room, she found him struggling for breath, and his mother, our daughter Christina, frantically calling the nurses' station for help. A pediatric intensive care specialist raced into the room and instantly diagnosed Wyatt with a collapsed lung. He ordered our baby grandson into the pediatric intensive care unit and called for the respiratory therapist, who prepared to inflate Wyatt's tiny lung. With the procedure successfully completed and Wyatt breathing without distress, Christina and Diana expressed their gratitude to the doctor for his swift and effective intervention. The specialist introduced himself by saying, "Mrs. Hagee, my name is Sam Zuckerman. I'm Jewish, and I have visited your church during the night to honor Israel. Because you are a woman of faith, I would like to tell you about an event that I believe will impact you as it has me." Diana was fully engaged and ready to hear what he had to say. Once I reached my destination, I immediately called home from the airport to get an update on our cherished grandchildren. As the Bible so rightly states, children's children are a crown to the aged. Proverbs 17, verse 6. I can say amen to that, for our 13 grandchildren are our pride and joy. Diana gave me her usual minute-by-minute update on Ellie and Wyatt, and then said, "John, I have to tell you something remarkable that happened tonight." And without taking a breath, she began to share the amazing account of a young patient Dr. Zuckerman had once treated. The doctor said that 3 years earlier, a colleague and his wife had experienced a sudden tragedy in their family. The husband was the chief operating officer at the hospital where Dr. Zuckerman worked, and these friends had made the decision to add a pool to their backyard since their 2 children, Alexandria and Jackson, had learned to swim. The day the pool was completed, the family was informed by the installer that they could not use it for several days due to the high concentration of chemicals in the water. David and Sherry took their 2 children into the house to prepare for dinner and celebrate the long-awaited addition to their home. Their youngest child, Jack, was an exuberant little boy of about 4, so no one was alarmed that he did not come when first summoned for dinner. However, after his parents called for him several more times, there was still no sign of Jack, and it was unlike him to not respond at all. The search was on, and suddenly David thought the worst. Could Jack possibly be in the pool? The father ran outside, and after searching the backyard, his fears were confirmed. His son was lifelessly floating in the pool, fully clothed and face down. David immediately pulled Jackson from the toxic waters as he frantically shouted for Sherry, who was frozen in shock, to call 911. The father attempted to revive his beloved son, but instinctively knew the situation was grim. The call to 911 was made. David continued CPR on Jackson for nearly 10 minutes on the pool deck. The boy remained unresponsive, but his parents never gave up on saving him. Finally, David and Sherry heard the piercing sound of sirens approaching their home. They were coming to their home for their son. It was surreal. Sherry kept their daughter inside the house as the ambulance and fire trucks arrived, explaining to Alex that Jack had fallen in the pool and that he would be taken to Daddy's hospital. Neighbors then took Alex to their home so she would not witness her brother being worked on. The emergency responders quickly assessed Jack and began administering medications and inserting IVs. The EMS crew continued the father's valiant attempt to revive the lifeless boy, but could not detect a heartbeat. Once Jack had been transported to the hospital, the emergency room doctor, a respiratory therapist, and a talented team of nurses and other medical personnel fought for his life for over an hour. The physician administered a series of medications and treatments to the tiny patient, but to no avail. Still no pulse. She decided to give Jack one last round of drugs before she would declare him dead. The last treatment series produced a faint heartbeat. After stabilizing Jackson a bit more, the ER doctor informed the parents that their little boy only had a 40% chance of living through the first night. The hours that followed were harrowing for all involved. That first night, as Sherry sat in the family room with their pastor, family, and friends, Dave stood in the corner of the room where Jackson was being treated and watched his son crash twice. Each time, the heroic efforts of the expert medical team brought him back to life. The pediatric critical care physician knew the only way the patient could survive was to call for a helicopter transfer to Houston's Children's Hospital and place the boy on a heart-lung bypass. Besides the fight for Jack's life, there was a fight against time. The chemicals in the pool had washed out all the pliability of the 4-year-old's lungs. An artificial lubricant was essential to keep him alive. But the hospital had to wait for the vital drugs to be flown in. When Jack's father asked why his son needed to be transferred to Houston, the physician responded, "Because we cannot sit here and watch him die." Thankfully, the vials of surfactant, the lubricant, were delivered from Austin's Dell Children's Hospital before Jack could be transferred. Later, the ER doctor told Dr. Zuckerman that even though Jackson had regained his heartbeat, she was concerned that he had gone so long without oxygen that he would be either brain dead or remain in a vegetative state. In telling the story to Diana, Dr. Zuckerman said he and several other specialists gathered around the tiny patient and decided to place Jack in an induced coma to allow his fragile lungs to heal from the chemical burns. They sedated him with paralytic drugs to prevent the child from waking and pulling at the numerous tubes, IVs, and PICC, or peripherally inserted central catheter lines that covered his small body. The temperature of the water in the pool had been 54 degrees. Jack's body temperature was 93 degrees when he came into the ER. Normal is 98.6. His body had gone into hypothermia, when body temperature drops below 95 degrees. This slowed his vital functions down, allowing his brain and heart to receive the most oxygen possible. The medical team kept Jack in a state of induced hypothermia to help him heal from the trauma. The 4-year-old was on an oscillatory ventilator for 9 days, followed by 2 additional days on a regular ventilator. Dr. Zuckerman explained that oscillatory ventilation forces as many as 540 tides or puffs of oxygen into the lungs per minute. This special apparatus caused Jack's little chest to rapidly rise and fall, but it was the only way the doctors could prevent their patient's lungs from collapsing. Jack's parents sat in vigil next to their motionless son's bed. Their baby boy had been so full of life a few hours ago. Now he was desperately struggling to stay alive. They reeled from the tormenting questions flooding their minds. This was not any patient. This was their Jackson. How long was he in the pool? How much poison did he swallow before his lungs became filled with water? How long was he without oxygen? Will our son live or die? And if he lives, What effect will this trauma have on his brain? Will he ever be the same? Only God had the answers. Minutes, hours, and days passed in drawn-out anguish as the family nervously anticipated the appointed time when the physicians would bring their beloved child out of his comatose state. David, Sherry, and Alex were surrounded by loving family and steadfast friends during their ordeal. Their minister, Pastor Robinson, visited and prayed with them every day. All anyone could do now was wait. Jackson's parents met with a dedicated team of specialists who walked them through the next crucial steps of their son's life and death crisis. Once their son emerged from the medically induced coma, they would wait, hoping for his eyes to open and his lungs to breathe unassisted. The next hurdle would be to confirm that Jackson's brain was functioning normally. The medical staff prepared David and Sherry that if and when Jackson woke up, he would most likely have significant neurological deficits. The days were filled with fierce anxiety and raw emotions. Time dragged by as David and Sherry spent countless hours praying for an answer to Jack's dire situation. They knew they needed a miracle, and a miracle is what they received. The evening before Good Friday, Sherry had a dream that her little boy would open his eyes. Early Friday, Sherry held her son's hand and whispered, "Good morning." And true to her dream, Jackson opened his eyes for the first time since his accident. The doctors had to keep him sedated, but God had given Sherry the confirmation she needed. Jack was going to be okay. The parents of this adorable boy watched in awe as he came back to life in the days that followed. As he was gradually weaned from the medications, Jack was able to breathe on his own. His motor skills were unimpaired, and amazingly, he managed a weak smile when he saw the faces of his ever-grateful parents. At one point, after the tubes were removed from his body and he was being held by his dad, Jack looked up into his father's eyes and said in a very weak whisper, "Daddy, I be okay? I be okay." The night before Jack was released from the hospital, the pediatric neurologist came to the young patient's room and gave his parents a copy of his EEG, a test that diagnoses brain function. Their son's numbers were textbook perfect. "I have no medical justification for these results," admitted the neurologist. He had felt sure that Jack would suffer significant brain deficiency based on the length of time he had gone without oxygen. His only explanation? "It was the grace of God."